This is Rhodesia, a country that lasted just 15 years but became one of the most controversial places on Earth. Our story begins in the 1890s with the British Empire's grand vision, a railroad stretching from Cairo to Cape Town. To make this grand vision a reality, Britain needed to secure vast stretches of land in southern Africa. Cecil Rhodes with the British South Africa Company led a charge to claim these lands, which would eventually be called Rhodesia in his honor. Over time, the region split into several colonies, with our attention turning to southern Rhodesia, where the rest of our story unfolds. By the 1960s, the British Empire was in decline and independence movements swept across its African colonies, demanding majority rule. But southern Rhodesia resisted, with its white minority government determined to hold on to power despite growing calls for African self-governance. As more and more neighboring British colonies gained independence and adopted majority rule, southern Rhodesia found itself increasingly isolated, refusing to abandon its white minority government. The breaking point came in 1965 when the government, frustrated by Britain's pressure to transition to majority rule, decided to sever ties and declare independence. This bold decision, known as the Unilateral Declaration of Independence, or UDI for short, was accompanied by a name change and the adoption of a new flag. With northern Rhodesia having become Zambia just a year earlier, southern Rhodesia was now the only country left with Rhodesia in its name. So the government decided to drop southern and simply become Rhodesia. This move sparked outrage across the international community. The UDI was quickly condemned, with every country refusing to recognize Rhodesia's sovereignty, leaving the nation diplomatically isolated. The UN also imposed sanctions, cutting Rhodesia off from global trade. However, Rhodesia found some limited support from a few countries, mainly its neighbor and fellow white minority government, South Africa. Additionally, Portugal, a declining European power with its collapsing African empire, also backed Rhodesia, hoping to strengthen the resistance against the African nationalist movements. With Rhodesia becoming more isolated, tensions within the country grew. African nationalist groups fighting to end white minority rule launched a violent uprising. This was the start of the Rhodesian Bush War. The Rhodesian military was well trained and better equipped, suffering far fewer casualties in battle. However, the African nationalists, with support from powerful allies like the Soviet Union and China, as well as neighboring African countries, kept up relentless attacks that drained the government's resources and morale. By the late 1970s, Rhodesia's external support also began to fade. South Africa, under growing international pressure and struggling with their own economic difficulties, could no longer afford to support Rhodesia. At the same time, Portugal, having lost control of its African colonies, withdrew its support completely. As the 1970s drew to a close, Rhodesia's position had become unsustainable. With the economy in freefall, sanctions piling up, and the war dragging on, the government had little to no choice but to enter negotiations. In 1980, Rhodesia transitioned to majority rule and officially became known as Zimbabwe.